I had been working the Hargrove Foundation Gala for exactly 4 hours when I realized the man at table 7 was going to die before dessert. Not because I'm psychic. Not because I'm some kind of hero. I'm a 28-year-old ICU nurse who picked up a catering shift on her day off. Because rent in Chicago doesn't care that you're exhausted. But 3 years of working overnight trauma shifts teaches you to read a room the way other people read weather. You start feeling the pressure drop before anyone else notices the storm. And something at table 7 was very, very wrong. Let me back up. My name is Simone. No, wait. That's not right anymore. I don't use that name. I go by my middle name now. Tatum. Tatum Breslin. I changed it 2 years ago, after my brother disappeared, because the people who made him disappear had my full name in a file somewhere. Changing it was probably paranoid. Definitely paranoid. But paranoid people who take precautions tend to still be alive, and I had decided very firmly that I intended to stay alive. My brother's name was Owen. He was 32 when he vanished. A forensic accountant who worked contracts for high-end consulting firms. The kind of firms that sometimes had clients you weren't supposed to ask questions about. Owen had started asking questions. 6 weeks later, his apartment was empty. His car was found at O'Hare long-term parking, and the detective assigned to his case had closed the file within 90 days. Insufficient evidence. No signs of foul play. I knew better. Owen had been sending me emails in the months before he disappeared. Encrypted. Careful. He'd set up a system where, if he didn't check in every 72 hours, the decryption key would forward automatically to an account only I knew about. He never checked in. I got the key. I read everything. What I found in those files had kept me awake for 2 years. The Sorrento Group wasn't a consulting firm. It was a financial clearinghouse for organized money. Old money. Dirty money. Money that needed to move across borders without attracting attention. They had legitimate clients, real businesses, real contracts, and underneath all of that, a network of people who owed them. Not just money. Leverage. Access. Silence. Owen had found something specific in their books. A pattern of payments to shell companies that trace back to a single source. A man named Aldrich Vane. I'd spent 2 years learning everything about Aldrich Vane. He wasn't a name you found easily. He existed in the spaces between things, in board memberships that didn't quite connect, in charitable foundations that filed their paperwork perfectly and never held a public event. He was the kind of man who owned things without his name appearing on anything. But I knew his face. Owen had photographed him once, from a distance, outside a building in River North. I'd memorized that photograph so thoroughly I could have drawn it from memory. And tonight, at table 7 of the Hargrove Foundation annual gala, Aldrich Vane was having dinner with a man I recognized from a very different context. His name was Sutton Hargrove, as in the Hargrove Foundation, as in the man whose name was on the building I was currently standing in, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. I knew Sutton Hargrove the way anyone in Chicago knew him. From magazine profiles, charity announcements, the occasional spot on the evening news when his foundation funded a new hospital wing. He was 61, silver-haired, the kind of wealthy that looked like old furniture. Solid, inevitable, impossible to imagine the room without. He had a daughter. Her name was Bridget, and she was sitting next to him at table 7, laughing at something her husband had just said. Her husband was a man named Ezra Calloway. And if you followed Chicago finance news at all, you knew that Ezra Calloway had spent the last 18 months restructuring the Hargrove family's investment portfolio, turning a legacy fund that had been quietly hemorrhaging money into something clean and growing and sustainable. He was respected. He was smart. He was completely relaxed at that table, one hand resting on Bridget's chair, with no idea that the man across from him had orchestrated the disappearance of at least 3 people that I knew of. I kept moving. I kept my face neutral. I was good at that. 3 years of delivering bad news in hospital hallways teaches you to keep your expression exactly as calm as the moment requires. But my mind was running scenarios the way it does at 3 a.m, when a patient's numbers start sliding. Why was Aldrich Vane at this gala? He didn't do public appearances. He didn't do charity events. He existed specifically to not be seen in rooms like this, unless this wasn't about the charity, unless this was about Ezra. I circled back to the service station and set down my tray, pulling out my phone under the guise of checking my messages. Owen's files were stored in an encrypted app, organized by subject. I pulled up the Sorrento Group folder and scrolled until I found the section I was looking for. Outstanding accounts. People who owed. There. Sutton Hargrove. Initial loan, $2 million. Taken out 4 years ago against a private investment that had gone badly sideways. Current balance with compounding fees and penalties, $6.8 million. Status flagged. Critical. And in the margin of Owen's notes, 3 words that made my stomach drop. Leverage acquired. Daughter. I read it 3 times. Then I looked back at table 7. Bridget Hargrove Calloway had no idea. I could see it in her face. The way she leaned into her husband's shoulder, the easy warmth of someone at a dinner where she felt completely safe. Her father was laughing too, but now that I was looking, really looking, I could see the edges of it. The laugh was half a beat too late. His eyes moved to Aldrich Vane's face after every sentence, just for a fraction of a second, checking something, measuring something. And Aldrich Vane was watching Ezra. Not the way you watch someone you want to have a conversation with. The way you watch something you've already decided to take apart. I thought about Owen, about the last voicemail he left me, the one I still had saved, where he said, almost casually, like it was something he'd just thought of, "Call me back when you get this. There's something I want to tell you about a project I've been working on. Nothing urgent. Nothing urgent." 6 days later, his apartment was empty. Nobody had called him back in time. I set my empty tray on the service rack and picked up a fresh one. Champagne for the main floor. I needed a reason to be at that table. There was a man sitting alone at the high top near the east corridor. He'd been there for 40 minutes. He had a glass of sparkling water and had declined every food pass I'd made. His eyes moved between table 7 and the main entrance with the steady, patient attention of someone who was waiting for something specific to happen. He wasn't a guest. I'd worked enough of these events to know the difference between someone killing time at a party and someone working. By the bar, 2 men in evening wear had arrived 30 minutes ago. They'd taken a position with a clear sight line to the east exit and the elevator bank. They'd ordered drinks. They hadn't touched them. I knew this configuration. Owen had described it in his files, not from this organization specifically, but from the source material he'd drawn on. When the Sorrento Group wanted to make something happen at a public event, they built redundancy. Multiple exits covered, a primary positioned for the signal, and a reason, always a reason, for the target to stay in one place just long enough. This was not a coincidence. This was a setup, and Ezra Calloway was the target. Not Sutton Hargrove, not tonight, because killing Sutton wouldn't send the right message. But making him watch his daughter's husband become an example. That would be the kind of lesson that collected debts from every other person who'd ever thought about not paying. I walked toward table 7 with my tray. My hands were perfectly steady. I have very steady hands. It's a professional requirement. I refilled a glass at the adjacent table. Then I moved around to the far side of table 7 and reached past Ezra's shoulder to take an empty flute. "There's a man at the east high top," I said, quietly. Not a whisper. Whispering is conspicuous. Just my professional voice, the one I use to tell people things they don't want to hear. "He's been watching your table for 40 minutes. The 2 men by the bar have blocked the east exit. Your father-in-law's guest is not who he's been introduced as." I set a business card, a blank one I'd palmed from the event coordinator's station, on the tablecloth under Ezra's hand. "The kitchen exit is through the service hall on your left. Don't look toward the east corridor." Then I was gone, moving back to the service station, heart slamming against my ribs, face completely blank. Ezra didn't look toward the east corridor. He was good. I'll give him that. He picked up his wine glass, took a sip, leaned toward Bridget, and said something that made her smile. Then he excused himself, bathroom, from the gesture, and stood up in a way that was slow and easy, and gave absolutely nothing away. Sutton's face went gray the moment Ezra stood. I watched from across the room. Sutton reached for his daughter's hand, held it too tightly. Patricia, Sutton's wife, had been on her phone for the last 10 minutes, and she ended the call with the kind of sharp efficiency of someone who had just received very bad news or was in the process of delivering it. Aldrich Vane's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved to the man at the east high top. A fraction of a second. A signal. The man at the high top stood up. I was already moving. I don't know exactly what I thought I was doing. I had no weapon. I was in a catering uniform, carrying a tray of champagne. But I had been in rooms where people were dying, and I had never once stood still and waited for someone else to fix it. It is not in my nature. I came around the column near the service hall just as Ezra came through the door from the main floor, moving quickly now, no longer performing casual. He saw me and stopped. "You're the one who warned me." "We need to move faster," I said. "The man from the high top is following you. The kitchen is cleared. I confirmed it 10 minutes ago when I was on a champagne run. There's a loading dock exit on the east side of the building. Who are you?" "I'm the person keeping you alive right now. Questions after." He looked at me for exactly 1 second, then, "Lead." I led. We went through the kitchen. Stainless steel and fluorescent light, and the controlled chaos of a catering operation. Staff moving in practiced patterns who barely registered us. And through the dry storage room, past shelving units packed with napkins and spare equipment, and out through the heavy fire door into the service alley. Behind us, I heard the kitchen door bang open. Voices. Fast footsteps. Ezra pulled out his phone. "I have a security team. They're at the main entrance. I need to reach. Text. Don't call. A call takes longer." He was already typing. 30 seconds later, 2 large men in dark suits came around the corner of the alley from the street side, moving toward us. Ezra's shoulders dropped, just slightly with relief. "My people," he said. "We're clear for now." I was already turning back toward the building. I needed to get back inside. Bridget was still in there. Sutton and Patricia were still in there. And if this went the same way these things always went in Owen's files. "Where are you going?" Ezra said. "Your wife is still at that table." He was already moving before I finished the sentence. We got back in through a side entrance with a key card from one of his security team. They were professional, fast, and clearly used to operating in exactly this kind of situation. Within 4 minutes, Bridget was out of the main hall, and in a car with Ezra's second. Within 8 minutes, they were out of the building entirely. Sutton Hargrove and his wife were not as easy. We found them in the atrium, surrounded by 3 of the men I'd clocked earlier, not pointing anything, not doing anything overt, just present in that specific way that communicated immobility without requiring a word. Sutton's face was the color of old paper. His wife was gripping her clutch with both hands. Ezra's security team moved efficiently. Within 2 minutes, we were all in the same conference room on the 3rd floor with the door locked, and Ezra was standing in front of his father-in-law looking at him, with the particular expression of a man who has just been handed information that changes everything and is still deciding what to do with it. "Tell me," Ezra said. His voice was completely level. "All of it." Sutton opened his mouth, closed it. His wife made a small sound, half breath, half sob. "Start with how much," Ezra said. The room was very quiet. I stood near the door because standing near doors is a habit I have developed. 6.8 million, Sutton said, finally. With the penalties. Originally 2, 4 years ago. A private deal. I thought it was a bridge loan through legitimate channels. I didn't know what the group was until it was too late, until they had enough of my financial records too. He stopped. His hands were trembling. They said they would help restructure the foundation's books. They said it was clean. By the time I understood what they actually were, I owed them enough that I couldn't go to anyone. "And tonight," Ezra said. "What was tonight?" Sutton couldn't look at him. Sutton. Ezra's voice didn't rise. It just got quieter. "What was tonight?" "They told me they wanted a meeting," Sutton said. "A conversation. They said if I could arrange for you to be present, just at a table, they would reduce the balance, cancel half the debt. They said they wanted to make you an offer. An employment offer. They said nothing about." "They lied to you," I said, from my position near the door. Everyone looked at me. The Sorrento Group doesn't make employment offers at public events surrounded by their own security personnel. The configuration I observed tonight. Multiple covered exits, a primary stationed for a signal, a subject positioned at a table and kept there. That's not a recruitment dinner. That's an acquisition. They weren't going to offer your son-in-law a job. Then what were they going to do? Patricia asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I thought about how to say it. I thought about Owen. I thought about the files I'd spent 2 years reading, the patterns I'd learned, the logic of organizations that communicate through consequences. Your son-in-law is one of the most respected restructuring specialists in Chicago's financial sector, I said. Killing him doesn't help the Sorrento Group. But making him disappear, making the man who turned your family's fund around, simply cease to exist, sends a message to every high-net-worth individual in this city who has ever thought about defaulting on an obligation to them. It says, we can reach anyone. We can take anyone. No amount of legitimate success protects you. The room was completely silent. But killing Ezra gives the Sorrento Group a body, I continued. A body means an investigation. A missing person with his profile means federal involvement. So they needed it to look like a disappearance. And they needed the last documented place he was seen to be a charity gala, surrounded by 500 witnesses who could all confirm he was perfectly fine when they last saw him. I looked at Sutton. They were never going to cancel your debt. They were going to let you watch. And then they were going to own you completely, because you would have helped them do it. Patricia made the wounded animal sound. Sutton put his face in his hands. Ezra stood very still for a long time. Then he turned to one of his security team. Get me Marcus. A pause. And call the attorney. Sutton looked up. Ezra. Don't. Ezra's voice was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was empty. Don't talk to me right now. I need to know my wife is safe. I need to speak to my legal team. And I need to understand everything you have documented about your dealings with the Sorrento Group. In that order. After all of that is done, we'll talk about what comes next. He walked to the corner of the room and made his calls. I watched Sutton and Patricia. Sutton sat folded over his knees, shoulders shaking. Patricia stared at the wall. She had the look of someone in the first minutes of understanding that the life they'd been living was not the life they'd actually been in. After a while, Ezra came back. He stood in front of me. I don't know your name, he said. Tatum, I said. Tatum Breslin. How did you know what you knew tonight? I told him. Not everything. Not yet, but enough, my brother. The files. 2 years of reading the Sorrento Group's patterns, until I understood them the way I understood cardiac rhythms. Not because someone taught me the right answer, but because I had looked at enough of them to recognize when something was about to go wrong. Ezra listened without interrupting. He was good at that too. Your brother, he said when I'd finished. Owen Breslin. I went still. You know his name. I know his work. I didn't know what had happened to him. He paused. When I was brought in to restructure the Hargrove Fund, I found anomalies in the older records. Discrepancies that suggested someone had been inside the accounts before me, tracing the same money flows I was looking at. The trail was good, professional-grade forensic accounting. I could never figure out who had done it or why the analysis was just sitting there unfinished, in archived files. Owen, I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. I think so, yes. Ezra looked at me carefully. Those files are still there. They're evidence. If your brother's analysis was what I think it was, and if we can connect it to the Sorrento Group's current operations, it's enough to build a federal case, I said, because I had read those files too, and I had spent 2 years trying to figure out how to use them without getting myself killed in the process. Not alone, Ezra said, but with the right legal team, and with the financial documentation from the Foundation's records, and with tonight's events on record, it becomes something prosecutable. Yes. We looked at each other. Why are you offering me this? I asked. Because you saved my life, he said. And because your brother deserved better than a closed file. He paused. And because I have a feeling you've been doing this alone for 2 years, and you don't have to anymore. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was thinking about Owen, about the voicemail, about the way I had listened to it so many times I had memorized every background sound, every pause, the exact tone of his voice, when he said nothing urgent in a way that meant he wasn't sure yet. I have conditions, I said. Name them. I want to be in the room when they dismantle it. Every step. I want to know what they find. Ezra nodded. And if they find anything about what happened to my brother, any documentation, any record, I want access to it before anyone else, Before the attorneys, before the investigators. Me first. Done, he said, without hesitating. I believed him. I'm a decent judge of people. You have to be, in the ICU. You learn very quickly to tell the difference between someone telling you what they think you need to hear and someone telling you the truth. Ezra Calloway was telling me the truth. The Sorrento Group didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It came apart the way bad structures always do, piece by piece, each piece pulling on the next. The federal case was built over 11 weeks. I sat in more conference rooms than I could count, going over Owen's files with investigators, who kept using words like remarkable and meticulous to describe his work, and every time they said that I had to look at the window for a second. The first arrests came on a Tuesday morning, quietly. Aldrich Vane was taken into custody at his home in Winnetka. Not a dramatic raid, just 2 federal agents at the door at 7:15 a.m., while he was presumably still drinking his coffee. I watched the news report on my phone in the break room at the hospital, between patients. I watched it twice. The financial network came next. Shell companies dissolved, accounts frozen, assets seized. The Sorrento Group's operations spanned 4 states and had tendrils into 6 legitimate businesses that had been unknowingly used as pass-throughs. Unwinding it took federal accountants longer than the initial arrests, but it happened. Steadily, thoroughly. The man who had been stationed at the East High Top at the Gala was identified, arrested, and eventually agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Through him, investigators were able to trace the specific authorization for what had been planned that night. It went directly back to Aldrich Vane. Documented, time-stamped, undeniable. And in a secondary file, buried in records that had been encrypted and stored in a server that took investigators 3 weeks to properly access, they found something that had not been on anyone's official radar. A record of payment, dated 26 months ago, for services rendered in connection with the case of one Owen Breslin, forensic accountant, whose investigation into Sorrento Group accounts had been deemed a critical liability. I was at my kitchen table when Ezra called to tell me they'd found it. I was still in my scrubs from a 12-hour shift. I sat with my phone pressed to my ear and looked at the window over my sink at the gray Chicago afternoon, and I didn't say anything for a long time. "Tatum," he said, finally. "Are you there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this isn't the answer you were hoping for. It wasn't. I had hoped, in the irrational way you hope for things you know are very unlikely, that Owen was somewhere. That the disappearance was a choice he'd made, for reasons that would eventually make sense. That somewhere in the world my brother was alive, and careful, and waiting for the right moment to reach out. That hope had been getting harder to carry for 2 years. But I had been carrying it. "No," I said. "It's not the answer I was hoping for." There was a pause on the line. "Owen's analysis is going to be cited in the federal prosecution," Ezra said. "By name. His work is going to be on record as a critical component of the case. The investigators want to acknowledge him formally in their documentation." Another pause. "I thought you should know." I sat with that for a moment. My brother was meticulous. He was careful and quiet, and he had spent the last months of his life doing something terrifying and important because he believed that what the Sorrento Group was doing was wrong, and he was not the kind of person who could know that something was wrong and do nothing about it. He would have liked knowing his work mattered. "Thank you for telling me," I said. 3 months later, I was sitting in the kitchen of Ezra and Bridget's house on a Sunday afternoon. It was the kind of Sunday that Chicago does in October. Cool and bright. The kind of light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. Bridget had made chili, which turned out to be her thing, apparently. She was a genuinely wonderful cook, and I had decided I was probably going to have to revise my feelings about charity galas, now that the most recent one had led me here, to this kitchen, to a bowl of chili that was making me feel like maybe things could eventually be okay. Bridget had asked me, early on, why I'd warned Ezra, not how, why. I'd thought about how to answer that. Then I said, because nobody warned my brother, and I had decided, somewhere in the middle of the worst 2 years of my life, that if I was ever in a position to be the warning that someone else didn't get, I would be that, whatever it cost. Bridget had looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you were there." I was, too. Eventually. Sutton and Patricia were in family therapy. Bridget was not ready to see her father yet. Maybe she would be, someday. Maybe she wouldn't. She had told me once, without any particular bitterness, that she understood they had been terrified and that terror makes people do things they would otherwise be incapable of. But understanding it, she said, doesn't mean I have to be okay with it right away. Maybe ever. She had said this the way someone says something they've worked very hard to actually believe, and I respected her for that. Ezra set down his coffee cup and slid a folder across the table toward me. "I want to show you something," he said. I opened it. Inside was a one-page document, clean and formal. A proposed role with a title, Financial Threat Analyst, and a description that was basically a very precise accounting of what I had been doing unofficially for 2 years, except with resources and support, and a team of people who could actually do something about what I found. A salary that made me quietly recalculate my relationship with overtime shifts. "This is attached to a non-profit investigative foundation we're setting up," Ezra said. "Not the Hargrove Foundation. Something separate, specifically focused on financial predation networks. We already have 2 federal agency partnerships in discussion." He paused. "I've been talking to the investigators. They think Owen's methodology could be taught, formalized into a framework for identifying these kinds of operations earlier. We want to build a program around it." I looked at the document for a long time. "The Owen Breslin methodology," I said. "If you'd be willing to give us permission to use his name." I thought about my brother. I thought about the voicemail, the encrypted files, the way he had built something careful and precise and devastating in the months before they found him. I thought about what he'd been trying to do with it, what he would have done if he'd had more time. He would have done exactly this. "Yes," I said. "You have permission." Bridget refilled my bowl without asking. Ezra made a note on the margin of the folder. Outside the kitchen window, the October light was doing what October light does, making everything look like it means something. Maybe it does. I still take the occasional catering shift sometimes. Not for the money anymore. I take them because I have learned that the most useful place to be is often the place where people assume you are invisible, and because the best warning systems are the ones nobody sees coming. I think Owen would appreciate that logic. I think he would appreciate a lot of things about how this ended.